大家好，我是 Jenny， 欢迎来到沉思者 J。 如果你看过上一集关于荣格的故事，你应该记得我在最后提到了一本书，一本手工制作的大书，用羊皮纸装订，用毛笔书写，配上荣格亲手绘制的彩色图画。那本书在他去世之后，被家人锁进一个金属箱子里长达48年。那本书的名字叫做红书。今天我们要把那扇门完整的打开，走进去看看里面住着什么。首先让我问你一个问题，如果有一天你发现，你的脑子里开始出现一些你无法控制的声音，各种奇怪的幻象在脑中涌现，你不知道那是天才还是疯狂，你会怎么办？大多数人会求助，会逃走，会想办法让那些声音消失，但荣格做了一个完全相反的选择。他说，我要走进去，我要和那些声音说话，我要把我看到的一切画下来，写下来。那个决定花了他将近6年的时间，那个决定差点让他疯掉，也正是那个决定，让他成为20世纪最重要的心理学家之一。红书的起点要从一个特定的时间说起。1913年秋天，荣格刚刚和弗洛伊德彻底决裂，那段关系的终结对荣格是一个巨大的打击。弗洛伊德曾是他最重要的精神父亲，也是他进入心理学世界的引路人。决裂之后，荣格失去了大部分的学术圈支持，他的事业遭到质疑，他的理论被排斥，他在某种意义上成了一个学术孤儿。就在这样的处境里，一个更深的危机悄悄降临。1913年10月17日，荣格独自坐在书桌前，突然一个幻象涌现了。他看见整个欧洲大陆被一片黄色的洪流淹没，死尸和废墟在水中漂流，血水把海水染成红色。这个幻象太过真实，让他怀疑自己是不是正在崩溃。几个月后，第一次世界大战爆发了，荣格才意识到，那个幻象不只是他个人的疯狂，那是某种更大的东西在透过他说话，是人类集体心灵深处最黑暗的预感。但那个幻象开了一扇门，从那之后，各种意象和声音开始源源不断地涌入荣格的内心。他描述那段时期说，感觉像是地下室的地板突然塌陷了，不知道下面还有多深。他说有一种强烈的感觉，他必须往下走，不能逃跑，因为如果他逃跑，那些东西就会在他看不见的地方继续滋长。1913年12月12日，荣格做了一个决定，他坐下来，让自己沉入那个黑暗，主动让那些幻象涌现，然后把一切记录下来。他后来把这个过程称为主动想象，是一种刻意和无意识深处对话的方法。你不是被动地接受梦境，你是主动地走进那个世界，和那里的人物说话，问他们问题，倾听他们的回答。在荣格的内在世界里，他遇到了各种各样的人物，其中最重要的一个是一位老人，荣格给他取名叫做菲利蒙。菲利蒙是一个胡须白长的老者，有一对翠鸟羽翼的翅膀，手里拿着一串钥匙。他在荣格的幻象中出现，和荣格长谈，说着荣格自己都没有想过的话。荣格后来说，菲利蒙让他理解了一件非常重要的事，那就是你脑子里的声音不一定是你自己的声音，心灵里住着各种各样的存在，他们有他们自己的想法，他们不是你的延伸，你只是和他们住在同一个空间里。这个理解对他后来发展原型理论至关重要。他说，是菲利蒙教会了我，心灵不是我的财产，而是我住在其中的宇宙。除了菲利蒙，荣格还遇见了一个他称为莎乐美的年轻女子，她代表的是安妮玛原型，那个住在每个男人心灵深处的女性能量。他引诱他，挑战他，让他不舒服，也让他看见他不愿承认的部分。还有一个他称为以利亚的老者，代表着智慧和预言，还有许多他无法完全描述的存在。那段时期的荣格每天活在2个世界里，白天他是一位丈夫和父亲，是一位接诊病人的心理医生， 晚上他把自己沉入那个无底的内在深渊，和那些看不见的存在说话。他的妻子艾玛担心他，他的孩子不明白父亲在做什么，他的同事摇头，有人说他疯了，但荣格说，我清楚地知道我没有疯，因为一个真正疯了的人不会问自己是否在疯。我在做的事情是危险的，但它不是疯狂，它是探索。这段探索持续了将近6年，从1913年到1919年，在那6年里，荣格把所有的幻象和对话全部记录在一系列的黑色笔记本上。那些笔记本后来被称为黑书，但黑书还不是红书。黑书是原始的记录，是第一手的草稿。1915年开始，荣格花了将近10年的时间，把黑书的内容重新整理，誊写在一本巨大的羊皮纸书上。他用中世纪的哥德体书法书写，他用水彩和金箔绘制插图，每一页都像是一件艺术品。那本书用了一个红色皮革封面，所以大家后来叫它红书。它的正式名称是新书，拉丁文叫做 Liber Novus， 意思是新的书。红书厚达230页，包含63幅荣格亲手绘制的彩色插图。那些图画令人叹为观止，有精密复杂的曼陀罗图案，有神话中的巨龙和天使，有深海中的怪物和星空，有荣格在幻象中见过的每一个存在，画在那里，像一个平行宇宙的地图。那些曼陀罗特别值得一说。曼陀罗在梵文里是圆的意思，是佛教和印度教中代表宇宙整体的图像。荣格在完全不了解这个传统的情况下，在他的探索过程中自发地开始画圆形图案。后来他才发现，这个圆形图案出现在全世界几乎所有的灵性传统里，不约而同。他认为这证明了集体无意识的存在，人类心灵在特定状态下会自发地召唤相同的形象。红书里有一段话，是荣格在幻象中听到的声音说的，意思大约是这样：我并不是在追求光明，而是试图让黑暗有意识地呈现出来。这句话非常荣格，它挑战了我们对灵性探索的一般想象。很多人以为灵性成长是追求光，是追求正面，是把黑暗消灭，但荣格说不是这样的。真正的成长是让黑暗也能被看见，被承认，被整合。一个只有光的心灵是不完整的，就像一幅只有白色的画，什么也看不见。红书的核心是荣格和他自己的对话，是他和自己内心深处那些他不认识的部分的对话。在这些对话里，他写到了灵魂是什么，他写到了神灵对他来说意味着什么，他写到了他对死亡的理解，他写到了人类的苦难从哪里来，他写到了意义是如何在最黑暗的时刻被找到的。其中有一段特别动人，荣格在幻象中走进了一片沙漠，他遇到了一个孩子，那个孩子告诉他，你必须先成为孩子，才能再次成为成人。荣格说，他花了很长时间才明白这句话的意思。那不是说要幼稚，而是说，真正的更新需要放弃你已经建好的那个自我，放弃你以为自己是谁，让自己重新开始。就像种子必须先死掉，才能长成树木。这和很多灵性传统说的死亡与重生有着惊人的共鸣。基督教的洗礼象征死亡与复活，佛教说的空，道家说的无，都在指向某种类似的东西。一个更新必须先从放弃开始。红书在1926年前后基本完成了文字部分，但插图的工作一直持续到更晚。荣格从来没有打算在有生之年出版它。他说，这本书是我私人的，它不是要给世界看的，它是我的锚。当外部世界的一切都在动荡的时候，我知道有一个地方我可以回去，那个地方在这本书里。他去世之后，家人把红书锁进了一个沉重的金属箱子，原因有几个：一是保护它，二是家人担心外界无法理解，三是遗产争议的问题一直没有解决。就这样，那个箱子安静地待在瑞士。几十年过去了，偶尔有几个被允许查阅的学者看到了一些内容，惊叹不已， 但无法公开讨论。直到2009年，诺顿出版社和荣格家族终于达成协议，红书以精装版的形式正式出版。那是一本真正意义上的书，几乎和原版一样大，收录了全部的插图原图，加上英文翻译和详尽的学术注解。出版的那一刻，震惊了全世界。第一版印了几千册，立刻售罄，进入了纽约时报畅销书排行榜。一本心理学家100年前写的私人手稿，成了现代的畅销书。艺术界说这是20世纪最重要的艺术品之一，心理学界说这是理解荣格理论起源的钥匙，灵性探索者说这是一份罕见的灵魂文献，哲学家说这是一个人类意识试图理解自身的最诚实的记录。那么红书到底说了什么？它的核心讯息是什么？我想用5个层次来说。第一个层次是内在旅程的可能性。红书告诉我们，人类的内在世界和外在世界一样真实，甚至更加丰富。那些梦境，那些幻象，那些无法解释的直觉，不是应该被消灭的杂讯，而是值得被认真倾听的讯息。第二个层次是阴影的整合。在红书的旅程里，荣格遇到了他最不想见到的部分，他的愤怒，他的恐惧，他的傲慢，他的软弱。他没有逃跑，他和他们对话，他接受了他们是自己的一部分。那个接受的过程，就是真正的成长。第三个层次是对立的整合。红书最深的主题之一，是光和暗的共存，理性和直觉的共存，个人和集体的共存，世俗和神圣的共存。荣格说，成熟不是选边站，成熟是在两极之间找到更高的统一。第四个层次是自信的实现。荣格在红书中所做的一切，都是在朝向他称为自信的那个东西移动。自信不是自我，自我是你以为自己是谁，自信是你真正是谁，包含所有的矛盾和阴影和光，是最完整的那个版本的你。第五个层次是灵性和心理学的桥梁。红书显示出，荣格的心理学从来不只是科学，它也是灵魂学。他试图用现代语言回答人类最古老的问题：我是谁？我为何而来？在黑暗中如何找到方向？红书的意义到了现代依然非常鲜活。它告诉我们，在这个要求我们永远保持正向积极的时代，也许真正的疗愈来自于允许黑暗存在，来自于不回避、不美化，而是真正面对。它告诉我们，创造力最深的泉源不在外面，而在里面，在那些我们从未敢走进去的地方。它告诉我们，一个人可以在最黑暗的时候选择记录，选择创造，选择把那个黑暗变成艺术，变成动线，变成让后人受益的智慧。荣格在开始红书的旅程时，他并不知道自己会走到哪里，他不知道那6年是不是会把他完全摧毁，他只知道不走进去就永远无法理解。那种在黑暗中前行的勇气，是荣格留给我们最重要的礼物之一。不是那些理论，不是那些术语，而是那个姿态，那个愿意不回避自己的姿态。有一个荣格晚年说过的话，他说，你生命中未曾活出的那部分，就会称为你的命运。红书就是荣格选择活出他内在那部分的记录。那个他没有活出来的部分，没有成为他的命运，而成为了他的杰作。今天 Jenny 说的是红书的故事。如果你对荣格整个人生和思想感兴趣，记得去看上1集的荣格完整故事，那2集放在一起，会给你一幅更完整的荣格图像。我们下次见咯。Hello everyone, I am Jenny. Welcome to Thinker J. If you watched our previous episode about Carl Jung, you may remember that near the end I mentioned a particular book, a handmade volume bound in red leather, written with a calligraphy brush and a careful medieval hand, filled with elaborate color illustrations painted by Jung himself. After his death, it was locked inside a metal safe by his family for 48 years. That book is called the Red Book. Today we are going to open that door completely. We are going to walk inside and see what lives there. Let me ask you a question before we begin. Imagine that one day, without warning, your mind begins producing visions you cannot control. Strange figures appear in your imagination and start speaking to you. Vivid and overwhelming imagery floods your inner world. You cannot tell whether what is happening to you is the beginning of madness or the beginning of something extraordinary. What would you do? Most people would seek help. Most people would try to make it stop. Jung made the opposite choice. He said, I am going in. I am going to speak with these figures. I am going to draw and write everything I encounter. I am going to follow this into the depths and see where it leads. That decision consumed nearly 6 years of his life. It brought him to the edge of psychological collapse. And it became the foundation of everything that made him one of the most important psychological thinkers of the 20th century. To understand how the Red Book came to exist, we need to go back to the autumn of 1913. Jung had just experienced the painful and final rupture of his relationship with Sigmund Freud. Freud had been more than a colleague. He had been a kind of intellectual father to Jung, the first great mind to fully recognize his gifts and bring him into the center of the psychoanalytic movement. The collapse of that bond left Jung professionally isolated. Most of the psychoanalytic community sided with Freud. Jung found himself cut off from the institutional world he had helped build. He was, in the most practical sense, alone. And then, in that already fragile condition, something far more unsettling began. On the 17th of October, 1913, Jung was sitting alone at his desk. Without warning, a vision overwhelmed him. He saw the entire European continent submerged beneath a tide of yellow floodwater. Floating debris, ruins, and bodies filled the water. The sea itself turned red. The vision was so vivid and so terrifying that he genuinely wondered whether his mind was beginning to disintegrate. The vision returned, and returned again, across several months. Then, in the summer of 1914, the First World War erupted. Within weeks, millions of people were being swept into the catastrophe. Jung realized with a jolt that the flood he had seen was not merely a personal hallucination. Something had been trying to speak through him. Something vast and collective had found a channel in his individual psyche. The boundary between his inner world and the outer world had become mysteriously porous. That recognition opened a door. From that point forward, visions, voices, and overwhelming imagery began flooding Jung continuously. He described the experience by saying it felt as though the floor of the basement had suddenly given way beneath him. He could not see how far down it went, but he felt a powerful and unmistakable conviction. He had to go down. Running away was not an option. Because if he ran, those forces would continue gathering strength in the dark, out of sight, beyond his control. The only real alternative was to face them directly. On the 12th of December, 1913, Jung made his decision. He sat down, allowed himself to sink deliberately into the darkness, and let the visions come. And he began to write and draw everything he encountered. He later gave a name to this practice. He called it active imagination. It is a method of deliberately engaging in dialogue with the unconscious mind. Not passively receiving dreams, but actively entering the inner world while still awake. Speaking with the figures that appear there. Asking them questions. Listening to their answers. Taking what they say seriously enough to write it down. In the interior world Jung entered, he encountered a remarkable range of figures. The most important of them was an old man with a long white beard, the wings of a kingfisher, and a ring of keys in his hand. Jung named this figure Philemon. Philemon became Jung's inner teacher. He appeared repeatedly in Jung's visions and entered into long conversations with him. He spoke in ways that surprised Jung completely. He said things Jung had never consciously thought. Jung wrote later that Philemon taught him something of fundamental importance. He taught him that the thoughts and voices arising in the mind are not always one's own. The psyche is not a single unified self. It is populated by many different presences, different aspects, different autonomous complexes. These presences have their own perspectives and their own agendas. They are not extensions of the conscious ego. The ego is simply one resident in a much larger inner community. The conscious self does not own the psyche. It inhabits it. This understanding became one of the crucial seeds from which Jung's entire theory of archetypes later grew. He said, "It was Philemon who taught me that the psyche is not my property. It is the universe I live inside of." Alongside Philemon, Jung also encountered a young woman he called Salome. She represented the anima, the deep feminine archetype that lives within every man's psyche. She was seductive, provocative, and unsettling. She confronted him with everything he wanted to avoid seeing in himself. She pushed him toward places his rational mind preferred to keep closed. He encountered a figure called Elijah, representing ancient prophetic wisdom. He encountered forces without names that he could barely describe. He encountered his own darkness, his own pride, his own terror, his own longing. During all those years, Jung lived in two simultaneous worlds. By day he was a husband, a father, and a practicing psychiatrist with a full patient load. By night he descended into the inner abyss and held his careful and often terrifying conversations with the depths. His wife Emma worried about him constantly. His children did not understand what their father was doing. His colleagues shook their heads. Some believed he was heading toward a breakdown. But Jung held a quiet and unwavering certainty about his own sanity. He said later that a person who is truly losing their mind does not ask whether they are going mad. The very fact that he could observe himself, question himself, and maintain disciplined records was itself evidence that his ego was still functioning. What he was doing was dangerous, he freely admitted. But it was exploration, not collapse. The process of active engagement with the unconscious continued for nearly 6 years. From 1913 through 1919. Throughout that period, Jung filled a series of black notebooks with raw and unfiltered records of everything he encountered in his inner world. Every vision, every conversation, every symbol, every image. These notebooks came to be called the Black Books. But the Black Books were not yet the Red Book. The Black Books were the raw and unprocessed first draft of the inner journey. Beginning around 1915, Jung undertook an extraordinary additional labor. He began transcribing and re-elaborating the contents of the Black Books into a large and magnificent volume. He wrote in an elegant calligraphic hand modeled on medieval Gothic script. He painted elaborate illustrations on each page in watercolor and gold leaf. He worked on this volume over the course of many years. Every page was both text and visual art. Every chapter was a manuscript illumination in the tradition of the great medieval scriptorium workers. The book was bound in red leather. That is why it came to be known informally as the Red Book. Its proper title, which Jung himself gave it, was Liber Novus. That is Latin for the new book. The Red Book runs to 230 pages. It contains 63 full-color illustrations made entirely by Jung with his own hands. The paintings are breathtaking. They include intricately detailed mandalas of extraordinary complexity and symmetry. Mythological figures including serpents, angels, and vast winged beings. Underwater creatures emerging from boundless depths. Starfields and cosmic architectures. And the faces of figures Jung had encountered in his inner world, rendered with the care and precision of a dedicated artist. The mandalas deserve particular attention. The word mandala comes from Sanskrit and means circle. The circular diagram is used in Buddhist and Hindu tradition to represent the wholeness and the unity of the cosmos. Jung began drawing these circular patterns spontaneously, with no prior knowledge of this tradition. He simply found himself compelled to create them at particular moments in his inner journey. Later, when he began studying Eastern traditions more deeply, he was astonished to discover that virtually every contemplative tradition on earth had independently produced similar circular sacred imagery. He took this as powerful evidence for the existence of the collective unconscious. The human mind, in particular states of depth, spontaneously calls up the same images, regardless of culture, regardless of century. There is a passage from the Red Book that I want to bring you. It captures something essential about what Jung was trying to do. The voice speaking in his vision said something that translates roughly like this. I am not pursuing the light. I am trying to allow the darkness to appear consciously. That is a very Jungian statement. It challenges one of the most common assumptions about what spiritual growth is supposed to look like. Many people assume that the goal of inner work is to find the light, to achieve positivity, to overcome and eliminate darkness. But Jung said something different. He said that real growth means allowing the darkness to become visible. Allowing it to be acknowledged and named. Allowing it to be integrated rather than suppressed. A psyche that contains only light is incomplete. It is like a painting made entirely of white. Nothing is visible at all. The forms only emerge when the dark is allowed to appear alongside the bright. The heart of the Red Book is a sustained dialogue between Jung and the unknown parts of himself. A conversation with everything in his psyche that had previously been unacknowledged, unnamed, and avoided. In the course of this dialogue, he wrote about what the soul is. He wrote about what the divine meant to him personally. He wrote about his understanding of death and renewal. He wrote about where human suffering comes from. He wrote about how meaning can be discovered in the midst of total darkness. One particular passage from his inner journey is especially striking. Jung found himself walking through a desert in his vision. He encountered a child. The child told him, "You must first become a child again before you can become an adult once more." Jung wrote that it took him a very long time to understand what those words meant. They were not an invitation to become naive or irresponsible. They were pointing towards something far more demanding. They were saying that genuine renewal requires surrendering the self you have already constructed. It requires releasing the identity you have spent years carefully building. It requires allowing yourself to become empty enough to begin again. Like a seed that must die before it can become a tree. This theme resonates with powerful force across many of the world's great contemplative traditions. The death and resurrection at the center of Christian spirituality. The Buddhist teaching on emptiness and the dissolution of the fixed self. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei, the return to an original simplicity before effort and ambition accumulate. All of these point toward something structurally similar. Genuine renewal must begin with a kind of release. A willingness to let the old form go. Jung largely finished the written portion of the Red Book around 1926. The painting work continued somewhat longer. But he never published it during his lifetime. He said that the book was personal. It was not made for the world to read. It was his anchor. When the external world was turbulent and uncertain, he said, there was always one place he could return to. And that place existed inside that book. After his death in 1961, his family locked the Red Book in a heavy metal safe. There were several reasons for this decision. Partly to protect the physical object. Partly because the family was uncertain whether the general public could understand what it contained. Partly because questions around the estate and intellectual rights remained unresolved for decades. And so the safe sat quietly in Switzerland. The years passed. Decades passed. A small number of scholars were occasionally permitted to view portions of the contents. They emerged shaken and astonished. But they could not discuss it publicly in any detail. In 2009, Norton Publishers and the Jung family finally reached an agreement. The Red Book was published in a facsimile edition. It was nearly as large as the original. It reproduced all the illustrations in full color. It included an English translation and extensive scholarly commentary. The response was immediate and unprecedented. The first print run sold out almost immediately. The book entered the New York Times bestseller list. A private manuscript written by a psychologist more than 100 years earlier had become a contemporary bestseller. The art world called it one of the most important visual artworks of the 20th century. The field of psychology called it the master key to understanding the origins of all of Jung's theoretical work. Those engaged in spiritual exploration called it one of the most honest and complete records of a human soul confronting itself that has ever been made available to the public. What, at its deepest level, does the Red Book have to say to us? Let me offer 5 layers of meaning. The first layer is the reality and richness of the inner world. The Red Book demonstrates that the interior life of a human being is not merely a pale reflection of external reality. It is a full and living world in its own right. The visions, the symbols, the voices, the figures that arise in dreams and imagination. These are not noise to be eliminated. They are communications from a part of the mind that knows things the conscious self has not yet recognized. The second layer is the work of integrating the shadow. In the course of his inner journey, Jung encountered everything in himself he most wanted to avoid. His anger, his fear, his pride, his capacity for destructiveness. He did not flee. He did not pretend those things were not real. He sat with them, spoke with them, and slowly accepted them as genuine parts of who he was. That process of acceptance and integration is what genuine psychological growth requires. The third layer is the integration of opposites. One of the deepest themes running through the Red Book is the necessity of holding both sides of every opposition simultaneously. Light and dark, rational and intuitive, individual and collective, human and divine. Jung wrote again and again that maturity does not mean choosing one pole and rejecting the other. It means finding a larger container in which both can be held and transformed. The fourth layer is the movement toward what Jung called the self. The self, in Jung's understanding, is not the ego. The ego is what we think we are. The self is what we actually are. It includes all the contradictions, all the shadow material, all the light, all the depths. It is the most complete possible version of a human being. The entire journey recorded in the Red Book is a movement toward this kind of wholeness. The fifth layer is the bridge between psychology and the life of the spirit. The Red Book reveals clearly that Jung's psychology was never merely a science. It was also, and perhaps primarily, a science of the soul. It was trying to answer, in the most honest modern language available, the oldest human questions. Who am I? Why am I here? How does one find direction in the dark? The Red Book speaks with particular urgency to our current moment. In a world that demands we perform relentless optimism and project polished and curated versions of ourselves, Jung says something almost revolutionary. Real healing does not begin by insisting on the positive. Real healing begins when we allow what is actually present to become visible. When we stop running from the darkness inside us. When we turn toward it with the honesty and courage it deserves. The Red Book also tells us something important about where creativity comes from. The deepest sources of creative work do not lie on the surface. They live in the unexplored territories within us. In the places we are most afraid to enter. The images that feel strangest and most difficult to acknowledge. The dreams that disturb us most. These are often the places where the most original and alive creative energy is waiting. And finally, the Red Book is a demonstration of a particular kind of courage. When Jung began his inner journey in 1913, he did not know where it would lead. He did not know whether the process would eventually destroy him. He knew only that refusing to enter the darkness would mean never understanding it. And for a man of his nature, that was not acceptable. That willingness to move into uncertainty without guarantees. To create without knowing the outcome. To record honestly what is happening without editing or softening. This is perhaps the deepest gift that the Red Book offers to anyone who encounters it. It is not the theoretical framework that matters most. It is the gesture. The gesture of a human being who decided that honesty about the depths of his own soul mattered more than the appearance of stability and certainty. Jung wrote in the Red Book that whatever we have not allowed to live within us will appear as our fate. The Red Book itself is the record of Jung choosing to live out what was inside him rather than suppress it. What might have become his fate instead became his masterpiece. This episode is a companion to our previous episode on the full life and thought of Jung. If you have not seen that one yet, I invite you to watch it alongside this one. Together they give you a much more complete picture of who Jung was and why his work continues to matter. I am Jenny. See you next time.